for his leadership in bringing Cleve here this evening. It's a real pleasure. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of all of us to say that. So just a couple of remarks, and I'll let Cleve on. So as we begin Pride Week in Buffalo, we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Riots. This year also marks the 40th anniversary of the White Riots in San Francisco. These catalyzing events color society's understanding of gay rights activism as bold, courageous, and passionate. As a member of the LGBT community, I am grateful for the risks that the organizers and protesters took to fight for their human rights at a time when doing so led to abuse, imprisonment, and death. It's powerful. They began what is a rich tradition of advocacy from which members of my generation benefit greatly. Unlike me, our speaker today did not spend his 20s seeing more and more pride flags displayed outside of homes, businesses, and at our city halls. Rather, he fought for our ability to fly them freely. Cleve Jones is a gay rights activist, an AIDS activist, and is the founder of the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. Together with Harvey Milk, Cleve revolutionized the face of politics in San Francisco and nationally. The vital work he did in bringing AIDS awareness to our country has gained international recognition and saved the lives of many in the LGBT community. To this day, he continues to advocate for equal marriage rights and with Unite Here, fighting to bring dignity and higher standards in the hospitality industry and beyond. It is a privilege and honor to welcome him here today. Please join me in welcoming.
Sure, I'm doing a good job, but somewhere very close by right now, some young person is getting ready to take his or her own life because they feel that they'll never fit in and that they're not worthy, and maybe they're being abused, maybe they're being mocked, maybe they're being bullied. But my story really begins with that reality. And are we doing the cards for questions? So there will be questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story, and then we're going to have questions if you want them, and then I'm going to conclude with a small story that I like to end my remarks with, sort of a story about the quilt. But my story begins when I was just a little baby homosexual, and my family moved to Arizona in 1968. Not a great place to be gay in 1968, or 2019 for that matter. And my parents were both graduate students when I was growing up. My mom went to Cornell, they were at Rochester, and then they both got teaching positions at Arizona State in Tempe, Arizona. So we moved there, and the bullying began almost immediately, and fortunately I had a family physician who seemed to be very sympathetic, and we decided that I had a serious lung condition that would not allow me to go to gym class because PE was not safe. And so every day during gym class, I would go to the library and I would hide out and I would read Life magazine in particular. How many of you are old enough to remember Life magazine? Yes. Remember, it was oversized, so it was good for a skinny little kid to hide behind when the bullies walked by. And it was there one afternoon that I was reading Life magazine and just idly flipping through the pages when I came to a headline that said, "Homosexuals in Revolt," and had all these photographs of hot young men in New York City and Los Angeles and San Francisco confronting the police. And I learned for the first time about the Stonewall riots, and really it was the first moment that I learned that I was not alone. There were other people, there was a movement, there was a community, and it was astonishing to me because for the last year and a half, I'd been stealing pills from my mom and dad. Both of them had had some medical issues, some surgeries, and there were a lot of strong pain pills in the house. And I was pilfering them one by one, very carefully, and I was hiding them because I figured at some point somebody's going to find out what I am, and there's going to be only one way out. And we made a lot of progress, but that is the way out that still too many of our young people are taking. And I don't think there's any doubt that if I hadn't stumbled on that article in Life magazine and learned about the Stonewall riots and Troy Perry and Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon and some of the great pioneers, Frank Kameny, I probably would have taken that way out too. But instead, I found Life magazine and I found gay liberation, and I flushed those pills down the toilet and I hitchhiked to San Francisco. I got there, and here I am, this idiot white boy from Scottsdale with long hair and no skills and no education. I ended up on Polk Street in the Tenderloin, and it was a pretty grim existence. But even though there were many nights when I was cold and hungry and alone, I got to witness that first wave of what we now call LGBTQ immigrants coming to San Francisco and really transforming the city. And one of the people that I got to meet was Harvey Milk. And he persuaded me to cut my hair and stop selling weed on the corner and go back to school. And so I enrolled in San Francisco City College in the film department. I wanted to make movies. I thought I would be a film director someday. And this was right when the first Super 8 cameras were coming out. Some of you are old enough to remember these Super 8 cameras. And I made my first little film. And Harvey and his partner, Scott Smith, were planning to have a little showing of Super 8 films in their camera store. It was actually a sheet tacked on the wall. This is a tradition that has continued. It's now called the San Francisco International Gay and Lesbian Film Festival, and attracts tens of thousands of people from all over the world every year. But back then it was just a small camera store, a sheet on the wall, and some Super 8 films. And I showed him mine, and he took me aside and he said, "Cleve, I'm sorry, you have no talent at all. You need to change your major." So he got me to transfer to San Francisco State and enroll in the political science department in the urban studies program, and bribed me with an internship. He said, "You do this and you can come with me. You know, I'm going to get elected." And I pointed out he'd already run and lost 3 times, but it wasn't a very effective bribe unless he actually won the election, which he did, and he took me with him. So I had the great, amazing experience of being one of Harvey's assistants in San Francisco City Hall, working on really mundane things like getting a stop sign put in at a dangerous intersection, and also historic things like the first gay rights ordinance in the state of California. You know, now that he's become mythologized and played by Sean Penn and everything, you know, I want you to know he was a real person. He was my neighbor. He was flawed. He was not a saint. He was not a genius. His personal life was often in disarray. He was a terrible businessman. He was dead broke when he got elected to the Board of Supervisors. He was funny. And I, as a very heterophobic young man, you know, I wanted to live in a ghetto. If you'd given me bricks and mortars, I would have built a wall to keep y'all out. And I wanted, you know, it was because I was damaged and I was hurt, and I didn't want to be around straight people because they frightened me. But Harvey was the opposite. And he had this extraordinary ability to just connect with everybody and to go campaigning with him for his own election and then later in the fight against Prop 6, the Briggs Initiative, just to see the genuine empathy and how he could use a little bit of humor and make fun of himself, but he could connect to anybody. And he could talk to the rich white people up on Nob Hill, he could talk to the firefighters and the garbage men, he could talk to the homeless people pushing carts. He just had that ability to find common ground with just about everybody. And I think that was probably the most important thing I learned from him. On November 27th, 1978, I was eager to get to work early because his 2 paid assistants, one of them, Ann Cronenberg, was off to Seattle to be with her family for Thanksgiving. And the other paid assistant, Dick Pavich, had just announced that he and a friend of ours named Jim Rivaldo were going to start a political consulting firm. So he was going to be leaving the City Hall job, and Harvey had told me that he was thinking about hiring me for that position as long as I kept going to school, at least part-time. So I wanted to show him that I was, ready to pitch in, and I got there early, and he walked in and asked for a file that I'd left in my apartment on Castro Street. He was annoyed with me, and he asked me to go get the file and come back as soon as possible. And then when he saw the crestfallen look on my face, he softened and said, "I'm sorry, I'm under a lot of stress right now, but just go back to Castro Street and get the file, have some lunch while you're there, and I'll see you later this afternoon." So I went to the apartment and got the file, and then as I was walking down the street, I saw that the union that I now work for, the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union, which is now called Unite Here. I don't know if you told Sheraton who I work for when he asked for that donation. But they were picketing a restaurant that had been trying to organize there. So I joined the picket line for a while, and I'm walking around, and the 2040 Visadera bus pulled up, and a woman yelled out the window, "Cleve, they shot the mayor." Our mayor was named George Moscone. He was the most handsome, charismatic Italian guy. He loved Harvey. He was a retail politician. He was magnetic. And every time I saw him, I couldn't even speak. He was so handsome and very powerful guy. And he and Harvey had created the notion of a progressive coalition, and for the first time brought together trade unionists, feminists, environmentalists, Latinos, African Americans, Chinese Americans, and LGBTQ people to build a coalition and take a majority on the city council. And it was that majority that became jeopardized when Dan White, the appropriately named Dan White, who was on the Board of Supervisors, a former police officer, resigned in a temper tantrum, giving George Moscone the opportunity to appoint a replacement, which would tip the balance. And the backstory of this that most people are completely unaware of is that we were under a court decree to desegregate, finally, our police and fire departments. So the Board of Supervisors were going to have to implement that consent decree. And when Dan White had a hissy fit and resigned, that gave George Moscone the ability to appoint a liberal to that position, thus flipping the balance on the board. And the Police Officers Association didn't like that, and Dan had already murdered George. I got to City Hall and went running to find Harvey, and came around the corner and found his body on the floor. I had never seen a dead person before. I was 24. And we were trapped there in his office with his body visible through the door. We played the audio tape he'd left because he predicted his assassination. And I remember just thinking, well, it's over now. It's all over. He was our leader, he was my mentor, he was my friend. Later I would reconcile with my father, but at that time Harvey was as close as I had to a dad. And all I could say to myself was, it's over. And we waited, and we bundled up the bodies and got them out, and just like, it's over now. And then the sun went down, and the people began to gather on Castro Street, gay and straight, young and old, black and brown and white, immigrant and native born, and we lit our candles, and we marched in that incredible procession that some of you have seen footage of. It was in a number of films, and we got to Civic Center Plaza, and it was just filled with the light of all these candles and all these different kinds of people holding on to each other and crying in the night as the fog came in. And I thought to myself, no, it's not over. It is just beginning. And it was frightening, and I think all of us that were there had this very acute sense that we were being allowed to participate in something that was really brand new. And so through the horrible grief and the loss and fear, there was also this great sense of determination and solidarity. Dan White went on trial, and somehow in San Francisco in 1978, they managed to impanel a jury that was all white and all heterosexual. That's quite an achievement. And so the rumors began that he was going to get off. And I went to the police. I went to the captain of the Mission District, which is where the Castro is, and he said, you know, if he gets off, there's going to be a riot. And then the cop was patting me on the head. He said, oh, don't worry, you people aren't violent. And then, on May 21st, 1979, the verdict came down, and Dan White was convicted of manslaughter. He had taken a gun and extra rounds. He'd evaded the metal detectors by going in through the basement. He'd gone to one end of the building, put 4 bullets in George Moscone, reloaded, went to the other end of the building, and put 4 in Harvey, including a coup de grace to the head. But this jury was convinced that he was a misunderstood young person who'd been eating too many Twinkies and drinking too many Coca-Colas, and the sugar imbalance had just made him go nuts. So when the verdict came out, we gathered again at the corner of Castro and Market, and we marched to City Hall, but we weren't carrying candles, we were carrying torches, and we burned every police car we could find. That was the May 21st White Night riots. The police then counterattacked and invaded the Castro and beat everybody up until we drove them out of the neighborhood. And the following day was Harvey's birthday, May 22nd, and we closed down the entire neighborhood and kept the cops out, and built a stage and put in a sound system, and we danced all night long without any violence at all, and sang happy birthday to Harvey Milk. It's now a state holiday in California. I got in a lot of trouble for the riot, and both the daily papers pretty much blamed me for doing it. And for the young people in the audience, I'm not offering this as career guidance, but I got a call from the Speaker of the California State Assembly offering me a job in Sacramento working in the Capitol. Oh no! And so I went there, and I was assigned to monitor the Assembly Health Committee. Now, I did not know anything at all about public health issues, so the first thing that I did, you have to remember this is long before the internet, was to subscribe to every public health journal that was out there so that I could quickly educate myself. And my job was to look at all of the bills that were coming to the Assembly Health Committee, and then work with the Democratic members of the committee to let them know what the leadership's position was on issues ranging from asbestosis to Alzheimer's disease. And it was there in June of 1981 that I read in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report out of the Centers for Disease Control the 4 short paragraphs that were the first words ever published about the disease we now call HIV/AIDS. And it described about a dozen gay men who were suffering from a disease called Kaposi's sarcoma and a very aggressive form of pneumonia called pneumocystis. Kaposi's sarcoma had been around for a long time. It was identified in the late 1800s, and it typically presented as small, raised purple lesions, mostly on the ankles and the feet, of older men, especially men of Jewish and Mediterranean descent. And those men died of old age. But among these young gay men of many races and ethnicities, the Kaposi's sarcoma was spreading rapidly across their bodies and attacking their internal organs. The pneumocystis pneumonia had also been studied, particularly on the East Coast in cities with large IV drug-using populations, and had also presented among patients in Pittsburgh who were waiting for transplants, whose immune systems had been deliberately suppressed so that their bodies would not reject the transplanted organs. But this was a mystery, of course, and at first people did not pay a lot of attention to it, and those who did pay attention to it weren't doing it in a particularly useful way, but I knew something was wrong, and I remember cutting that out and putting it on my bulletin board. And about 3 weeks later, I got a call from Dr. Marcus Conant, who was a dermatologist at the University of California, San Francisco, who wanted me to have dinner. And then he told me, he said, I think it's a new disease. I think it's some kind of complex virus. I think it's sexually transmitted. I think it destroys the immune system. And it's fatal. And maybe has a really long incubation period. This is what he told me in the summer of '81. And I looked at him and I said, well, then we're all dead. And he said, probably. That was summer of '81. By the fall of 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying or caring for someone who was dying. It went through my neighborhood like, I don't know what's the metaphor for it, a tsunami, a slow motion avalanche. It just came through us and took everyone I loved. In November, as I was planning the annual candlelight tribute for Harvey Milk and George Moscone, I was walking up and down the Castro with my friend Joseph with our staple guns, putting up the posters, reminding people that once again we would light our candles and march down Market Street to remember Harvey and George. And we stopped at the corner of Castro and Market to get a slice of pizza and a Coke. And I looked at the newspaper rack and there was a headline. It said 1,000 dead of AIDS in SF. We'd already lost 1,000 people. And I remember standing at that corner of Castro and Market, and some of you have been there. You know it's a beautiful neighborhood with restored Victorians and cafes and clubs, and anytime you go there, you're going to smell coffee and food, you're going to hear music and laughter, and all of the pretty Victorians are there, and I could tell you a story about every one of those buildings. This is where Henry died, this is where Bob died, this is where George killed himself when nobody came to see him, this is where Alan starved to death because he was too weak to get food and nobody knew he was sick. And here's where Scotty got evicted when his landlord found out what was wrong, and he died on the sidewalk. But there was no evidence. There were these mind-numbing stories talking about statistics, percentages of hemophiliacs who have now been infected, percentages of IV drug users, percentages of African Americans, the Haitians. And I got angrier and angrier, and I remember saying to Joseph, you know, if this was a meadow with 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then people would look at this and they would see it for what it is and they would understand, and if they were human beings, they would be compelled to respond. But there was no response. And we had a president at the time who has since been elevated to sainthood in some quarters, who would not say the word AIDS publicly until more Americans had been killed by it than died in the entire Vietnam War. And I was very, very angry. I am still angry. So that night on November 27th, when we gathered to remember Harvey and George, I brought stacks of poster board and sacks of magic markers, and I had Harvey Milk's old bullhorn. And I talked to the crowd and I said, you know, we're here to remember Harvey and George, but we've lost a lot more than Harvey and George. How many of you have lost a friend or a lover or a roommate or a colleague? So write their names down. At first people were ashamed to do it. You know, the stigma was so powerful that people were ashamed to write the names of their loved ones who had died. And then finally one kid took two pieces and taped it together, and he wrote, Thomas J. Farnsworth Jr., my brother, he's dead. And other people looked at that and became ashamed of their shame and began to write the first and last names of their loved ones. And so we marched, as we always do, with the candles down to City Hall, and we left our candles there on the steps of City Hall for Harvey and George. And then I had everybody go another block to the old Federal Building that housed Reagan's Health and Human Services West Coast offices, and I'd hidden extension ladders in the shrubbery around the corner, and I got this nun with a beard on a bicycle to distract the police over here, and then we put the ladders up on the wall, and we climbed up with big rolls of tape on our wrists, and we covered the gray stone facade with this patchwork of names. And I looked at that and I thought to myself, wow, this looks very strange. And I walked through the crowd. It started to rain a little bit. There were no speeches or music or chanting, just thousands of people standing in the light rain and reading the names and whispering to each other. And so I went to school with him. I didn't know he was dead. Nobody told me. What are we going to do? And I could just feel this deep yearning need to find a way to grieve together and also to warn the world of what was to come. I flunked biology in high school, but I know there's no such thing as a gay virus. And I got to the edge of the crowd and I looked back at that patchwork of names and I thought it looks like a quilt. I thought of my grandma, my great-grandma back in Bee Ridge, Indiana, and the quilts that she'd sewn. One of them is still on my bed at home right now. And it was such a warm, comforting, middle American, middle class, traditional family value sort of symbol. And I believe in family values, and I want them to apply to me and my family. And that was the idea, and I blinked and I could just see it. I could just see the National Mall covered with fabric, all different colors and textures, sewn together by the hands of people whose hearts were filled with love and grief and, like me, rage. And that was the idea. And everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. Oh, Cleve, I don't think people sew anymore. It sounds really expensive. I don't know. Isn't it a little morbid? I don't know. And I just kept talking about it. It got to the point where I would walk in a room and people would roll their eyes and say, oh, her, she's going to talk about the quilt. And meanwhile, my very best friend in the world was back in Providence, Rhode Island, to die. His name was Marvin Feldman. And I met Marvin when we both got jobs, the most god-awful job I've ever had. I sold Time Life books over the telephone. It was so crushingly boring. And I would make up different nom de phone to pass the time and amuse myself. And I would call people up. Hello, Mrs. Smith? Hi, this is Willie Loman calling for Time Life Books. How are you this evening? I'm calling about High Sierra, one of the books in our American Wilderness Library. It's full of all the photographs that made Life magazine famous and blah, 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 blah. And then one day I'm doing this shtick, and when I did my Willie Loman line, and those of you who didn't laugh, you need to read books. Arthur Miller, Death of a Salesman. So I did that, and I heard this little burst of laughter, and I turned around, and there was a new boy working at Time Life. And he was so fine. Oh my God. His cheekbones, and his neck, and his gray blue eyes, and his curly hair. I was completely smitten at first glance, and I asked him out that night. We had our first date immediately. It was a very romantic little spot called The Stud on Folsom Street. And we went down there and played pool and danced. And then he walked me home and kissed me. And I said, you're going to come in and spend the night, right? He said, you know, I think we're going to be friends. I know, right? Don't you just hate it when that happens? I said, oh, just I need another friend. Right? Okay. But you know, I most sincerely hope that all of you live to be at least 100. I wish you all long, healthy lives, and at the end of your lives, when you look back, if you ever had a friend in your life like I had with Harvey Feldman, you would know how really blessed you were. We did everything together. We traveled. He didn't really care much about politics, but whenever I was on stage, he was in the audience. I didn't know much about theater, but when he was on stage, I was in the audience. And going to Providence was the most difficult trip. Most of you've done it. Those of you who are young, maybe not yet, but you know, we all do it. We get on a plane or a bus or a train, and we go to say goodbye to somebody that we love so deeply and we'll never see again. And I felt great anxiety as I approached the Feldman house, wondering how I would be treated, what would the rabbi be like, how was it going to be, but all of my fears evaporated when I walked into Esther Feldman's kitchen and smelled the food she was cooking and felt the love of that family, and I got to hold Marvin in my arms one last time before he died. I got back to California and tried to focus on work, And I went public with my own diagnosis. The antibody test had come out, so I learned I had the virus. And one of the consequences of that was that I was attacked by skinheads and beaten and stabbed. So after learning that I was positive and losing my best friend and being stabbed, my heart was full of hatred and fear and despair. And the quilt replaced those with love and courage and hope. And the quilt did a lot of things for a lot of people in a lot of countries all over this planet, but what it did for me was to connect me with all those good people out there who don't hate each other, with the moms and dads who would never imagine abandoning their child, and all of the good, ordinary people whose names will never be remembered, who just stepped in and took care of the sick and comforted the dying and raised the money and led the marches. And it was an extraordinary experience. I didn't get sick until '93, and then I got really sick, and I thought it was over. I began to lose my vision, I lost my hair, my fingernails, I had terrible fungal infections, and then ACT UP stormed the NIH, confronted the FDA, and got those first drugs. I don't know why they call it a cocktail. That is a slander against vodka tonics as far as I'm concerned. Those of you who know what T cells are, I was down to 23. I named mine, and I was getting ready to die, and then I got into that. It was the very first clinical trial of a combination. And what ACT UP wasn't just about shouting and marching and screaming at Reagan and then Bush. It was about science and changing the protocols. There were thousands and thousands of us who were willing to be guinea pigs. We didn't want to wait for all those double-blind placebo studies to be done. We said, test it on us. What have we got to lose? I was one of those people. I'm alive today because of the movement. I owe my life to the movement. The movement saved my life twice. Once when I was a 15-year-old kid getting ready to commit suicide, and again when I'm in my 30s dying of AIDS. The movement saved my life. I wouldn't be here without the movement. That's what motivates me and keeps me going. It was a long haul to get back healthy again, and then I started working with the labor movement, and now I work for Unite Here. We represent 300,000 hotel and gaming and food service workers across the US and Canada. And I'm often frustrated with some of my siblings on the left who spend so much time talking about talking. You've heard this, you've seen it on social media. The endless debates about pronouns or how many stripes to add to the flag. Well, in my union, we negotiate through collective bargaining contracts in Alabama and Louisiana and Texas and Florida that protect queer and transgender workers from discrimination and harassment and abuse and pay for their health care. That's what we do. We win substance. We have victories. And it's something that has helped me stay sane in this in this new era in which we're living. So I think, the theme of my life is that there have been so many times when I thought my life was over. I thought it was over before it began. I thought it was over when Harvey got shot. I thought it was over when I got sick. And I have to tell you, in November of 2016, I was home in my apartment on 18th Castro, and my boyfriend was in Washington, D.C. on business. He's younger than I am, we text a lot. And I'm watching the news like all you were, and I saw the first states come in, and I texted him. I said, I don't think this looks good. And he texts back, he says, it's not over, don't give up, show's gonna win. And then Florida. And I said, I texted him, honey, I think it's over. No, don't give up. and then I think Maryland, and then Pennsylvania. And at that point I was beside myself. I couldn't text anymore. My thumbs were bleeding. And I called and started yelling, it's over, it's all over. And he listens patiently, and after about 30 seconds, he cuts me off and he says, honey, you just went from 0 to Auschwitz like that, Are you alone in the apartment or something? I said, yes, and he said, well, you need to get down to Castro Street to get to work. So I went down to Castro Street, and there were a few dozen people, and we blocked Market Street, and then there were a few hundred, and then a few thousand, and then tens of thousands, and we marched all night through every neighborhood in San Francisco, and we were gay and straight and young and old and black and brown and white and immigrant and native born, and we marched and we marched, and we're still marching because it isn't over. Now, I'm well aware that I'm standing in the middle of a county that voted 57.2% for this guy, and I'm hoping that all of you will do that work that is necessary. And if you are somebody who might have voted for him, I hope that you now see, and I have relatives that voted for Trump, and I still love them, they are still my families, and as angry as we get and as fearful as we get, and I think, what you said earlier, this is an appallingly frightening time in human history, not just for our country, but for the world. We are on the brink of something I think could be beyond comprehension at this point. And in my experience, you don't change people's minds by telling them they're stupid. You don't change people's minds by telling them that they're evil. And I'm not one of these people that holds out a great deal of hope for winning those folks back, but I'm an old man now, and I've learned not to give up on anybody. So you have some work to do here, and I hope that you will all do everything that you can, because anything that anybody cares about, whether it's the environment or LGBTQ or women's rights or peace or justice or any of it, it all hangs in the balance. And I am so frightened, but I also have hope that this might be a turning point that we can look back to years from now and say, this is when it all changed. And this is when all of the hateful old ways finally did crumble. This was the last gasp of an oppressive system that brutalized people and destroyed the planet, but we got through it and we defeated it and we moved forward. So that is my hope for that. Now, as you can tell, my voice is running out, so do we have questions? Oh, here we do. And then I'm going to tell you one more story. And